more than Israel does. It's philosophers, it's academics, it's military leaders, it's politicians. How do you react when they fire from civilian areas at your soldiers and at your civilians? How do you evaluate the life of an Israeli civilian, an Israeli child, against the life of a Palestinian child or the life of an Israeli soldier? These are debated endlessly. Israel has no interest ever in killing a civilian. Look what it does to its reputation when it happens. It's clearly always the fault of Hamas because they fire from behind human shields. That's their policy. Second point that has to be made is that we now know why Hamas agreed to the ceasefire. Everybody was wondering, why suddenly did they agree? Because all the while, they were planning this kidnapping, this assault, this breaking of the ceasefire. They were planning to use the ceasefire as an excuse to do what they wanted to do right from the beginning, kidnap an Israeli soldier and hold him for ransom and extortion. And this may mark the end of any further ceasefires based on any kind of trust.
Mark, do you agree with that?
I agree with about 10% of what Alan said. I do worry that the breaking of a ceasefire or even the language of breaking of a ceasefire can make it much more difficult long term to have other ceasefires. It also makes any possible negotiations with Egypt, which were being planned this week, null and void. I disagree with much of what he said, and it seems to me that Alan may have circumvented the question, which was, how do you respond to children in a school dying at the hands of Israeli bombs? And the question is that it is morally reprehensible, and the United Nations has every right to stand out and speak out against that, and I would hope that they would. And if Hamas has broken this ceasefire and killed that poor 23-year-old Israeli soldier, I hope that they would also get international condemnation. But I would like to see that investigated, because there have been so many moments where Israel has used the unfortunate death of someone as a pretext for further siege. Oftentimes, because if you talk to Hamas right now, they'll say that kidnapping happened before the ceasefire. I don't know if it's true or not, but I think we need to investigate and find out. But I think it's very dangerous to frame Hamas as a group of terrorists purely, as opposed to people who are trying to negotiate as well.
Really, Mark? Go ahead, Alan.
And that's not, let me be clear. I'm not saying that. That's not a pro-Hamas statement. I'm not defending Hamas. I'm simply saying that it doesn't move the conversation forward to simply dismiss Hamas and not also talk about these other issues. Let me be clear about that.
It's a pro-Hamas statement, whether you intend it that way or not. The United States, Canada, most of Europe have designated Hamas to be a terrorist organization. Terrorist organizations don't play by the rules. And where the UN goes wrong is it must place the blame for the attacks on the UN facilities on those who use the UN facilities from which to fire rockets. That's the double war crime. Using human shields, hiding in schools, putting your rockets in schools. You know that the rules of engagement...
But in fairness, Alan, in that particular school, the United Nations says it warned the Israeli military 17 times that this was a shelter and there was nothing to fear, and yet the school came under attack.
But there was something to fear. Israel has videotape proof that the area around the shelter was being used by Hamas to fire rockets at its soldiers. Let me ask you this.
Are you justifying the bombing of a school?
Or an American commander, would you tell your troops not to fire back if enemies were trying to kill your soldiers from behind UN facilities? Would you like to be the one who calls the mother of the American soldier who's been killed and said, sorry, your son died because we told him not to fire back when he was being fired at because the enemy was using UN facilities as human shields? No country would do that.
I'm baffled at your logic, Alan. On the one hand, you're constantly accusing Hamas of using human shields, and yet you're somehow justifying the bombing of a UN school or shelter with children in it. A UN shelter with children in it. Yeah, no, I mean, you essentially are. You're saying, well, what would you do in that circumstance, as if that makes the logic reasonable. At the end of the day here,
what would you do? What would you do, Mark, if you were being fired on from a UN shelter and the choice was being killed by enemy terrorists or firing back at them, trying desperately to avoid civilians, but knowing that there is a possibility that civilians...
Not a possibility.
Your enemy, because your enemy, yes, it's only a possibility, because Israel goes to great efforts not to hit civilians, but they know that they may have to do that in an effort to get at the terrorists. You would fire back to everybody to fire back.
And 80% of the Palestinians dead are civilians. It's absurd to suggest. 80% of
it's doing it.
Well, Alan, pause for a second and let Mark get a word in. Mark, go ahead.
He's filibustering, that's all. 80% of the people in Palestine who have died are civilians, so if they're going to great care, they're not doing a very good job. I also don't begin from the place of, because Alan always begins from placing Israel in a defensive position and saying, what would you do if these people were firing upon you? The problem with that logic is that that begins with Palestinian resistance as opposed to Israeli occupation. If you begin from the place of Israeli occupation and you talk about Palestinian resistance to that, then suddenly the question should be, what would you do if you're Israel and you're an apartheid state and you're an occupying force? That to me is the more fundamental question here. And again, I'm not, and hold on, Alan, and hold on, Alan, and hold on, Alan, please. And once again, I'm not defending the killing of innocent children. I'm not defending breaking of ceasefires. I'm not suggesting that Hamas is above critique. I'm not pro-Hamas, I'm anti-occupation, and that's a very different conversation, and that's what the United Nations is attempting to do.
Apartheid states were engaging in bigotry. Look, I fought against apartheid. I was part of the legal team for Nelson Mandela. I know what apartheid is. How dare you call Israel an apartheid state? Arabs and Jews worked together, lived together, served in the Knesset together. The Gaza was emptied of all occupation in 2005 and 2007. Israel left behind all of the greenhouses. Hamas turned them into terrorist rockets. Shame on you for calling Israel an apartheid state. Well, you have become part of the problem, not part of the solution, Mark.
Well, your moral censure aside, I'd like to respond to that. First of all, if you look right now, there's first, second, and third class citizenship for Israelis versus Arab Israelis and Palestinian Israelis. Excuse me, Arab Israelis and Palestinians.
Please, Alan, let Mark respond.
I'll just wait for him. Are you done? Thank you, sir. If you're talking about occupation ending in 2005, right now Gaza is still controlled by land, by air, by sea. Israel still has a blockade. Israel still controls the population registry. Israel still controls the electromagnetic sphere. Israel still controls movement. Israel still controls the entering and leaving for Palestinians. It still controls the construction supplies. It still controls the water, the food that comes in. It still controls the economy. Palestinians have not had one day of self-determination. If you don't call that second-class citizenship and an apartheid state, shame on you.
Well, you talked about Israel being an apartheid state, number one. Number two, Israel...
Address those points I made, though. Address those points I made, Alan. Address those points instead of...
Gaza, you're interrupting me. Gaza has had self-determination. They voted, and the foolish people in Gaza voted for Hamas, and look what it's gotten them. It's gotten them horrible conditions. It's gotten them turning the possibility of having a wonderful area of Gaza turned into a terrorist base. And when you use your civilians, by the way, another myth is that Gaza is very densely populated. Look at a map sometime, and you'll see there are areas of open space that Hamas could use to fire rockets. They choose to go to the dense areas of the Gaza Strip rather than to the empty areas, precisely because they want to incur civilian casualties. I call this the dead baby strategy. They know that when they put their rockets in front of civilian areas, Israel will have to respond, children will die, and they're ready to show those children on television. The media falls for it, you fall for it, and that only encourages Hamas to do it again and again and again.
All right, Mark, last word, then I've got to go. Mark.
I'd be curious to know, although I don't want you to answer it now, Alan. I'd be curious to know if Alan has any critique of Israel. Alan is tearing down the straw man that Hamas has things to critique, that Hamas has made mistakes, and Hamas is worthy of moral censure as well. I begin from the place of saying, look, I'm not pro-Hamas, so his critiques of Hamas, some of them I agree with. But again, Alan seems to refuse to acknowledge that everything that Hamas is doing, everything the Palestinian people are fighting for, is from a posture of resistance to occupation. The fact that he denies that occupation, the fact that he ignores the United Nations censure of the
seven who were doing before
the last word.
All right, I'm going to have to end this, gentlemen. Sorry. No. Okay, I got to end this here. Thanks to you both for being with me. I appreciate it. Alan Dershowitz, Mark Lamont Hill. We'll be right back.